Racist cop destroy black woman's passport, calling it fake, not knowing she's a UN diplomat. Dr. Naomi Carter adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase as she approached the passport control desk at Heathrow International Airport. She was dressed in a navy blue business suit, her posture upright and poised. As a high-ranking human rights diplomat with the Global Equity Commission (GZ), Naomi had traveled across continents, advocating for justice and systemic reform. Today, her destination was Geneva, where she was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at a United Nations conference on racial discrimination in border enforcement. The digital display above the counter indicated that her flight was departing in 2 hours. She approached the immigration officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weary scowl, and handed over her diplomatic passport with a courteous nod. "Good morning," she said, her voice professional but warm. The officer, Gerald Whitmore, barely glanced at her before flipping open her passport. His expression darkened almost immediately. He furrowed his brows and held the document up to the light, as though expecting some hidden forgery to appear. Naomi had seen this before, the scrutiny, the hesitation, the unspoken assumption. After a few long seconds, he exhaled sharply. "Something doesn't match." His voice was laced with skepticism. He motioned for a younger colleague, Officer Daniel Reeves, to come over. The two men began whispering, exchanging glances as they examined her passport. Naomi felt her stomach tighten, but she remained composed. She had nothing to hide, and she refused to let them see any sign of frustration. "It's a diplomatic passport," she stated calmly. "Everything is in order." Officer Whitmore ignored her words, his fingers tapping impatiently against the counter. Finally, he turned to her with a smirk. "Ma'am, this document doesn't look authentic." Naomi blinked, her carefully maintained composure cracking slightly. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice firmer. Officer Reeves crossed his arms, his expression cold. "We believe this passport is fake," he said flatly. A murmur rippled through the waiting passengers behind her. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes watching. Some glanced at their phones, others whispered among themselves. The tension in the air was unmistakable. "This is an official GEC diplomatic passport," Naomi insisted, her voice unwavering. "Check your system. My credentials are valid." Officer Whitmore, however, reached under the counter and pulled out a pair of scissors. Naomi felt her heart slam against her ribs as she realized what was about to happen. Snip. The sharp sound of metal slicing through paper echoed in the room as he cut off the corner of her passport, leaving a deep, irreparable gash. A collective gasp surged through the crowd. Naomi stared at the ruined document, her breath caught in her throat. The symbol of her status, the very credentials that ensured her safe passage across borders, had just been destroyed in front of everyone. She snapped her gaze back up to Whitmore, fury flashing in her eyes. "You've just destroyed an official document of the Global Equity Commission," she said, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "Call your supervisor, now." But Whitmore remained unfazed. "Lower your voice, ma'am," he said coldly. "Step aside." Naomi didn't move. "You will explain why my passport was just defaced without cause," she demanded, "or I will be contacting my office immediately." Officer Reeves took a step forward, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. "You'll come with us for further questioning," he ordered. Two uniformed airport police officers emerged from a side door, flanking Naomi on either side. In the background, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "This is racism," someone muttered. "She did nothing wrong," another voice chimed in. Naomi reached for her phone, ready to call the GEC headquarters, but one of the officers grabbed her wrist. "No calls allowed," he snapped. At that moment, a passenger near the back lifted their phone, camera lens pointed directly at the scene. Naomi met their gaze, her silent plea unmistakable. "Document this." She exhaled sharply, reminding herself that losing her temper wouldn't help. She had been in high-stakes diplomatic meetings, negotiated with world leaders, and faced systemic prejudice before. But this was a blatant abuse of power. Still, she refused to give them the reaction they wanted. Without another word, Naomi turned and walked between the officers, her posture unyielding, her chin lifted high despite the humiliation crushing her inside. As she was escorted away, her mind raced. She knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. And as the first video of the encounter hit social media, she wasn't the only one who knew it. Seated in a stark interrogation room, Naomi Carter took a slow, deliberate breath, her mind racing even as she maintained her poised exterior. The small, windowless space reeked of cheap disinfectant, and the metal chair beneath her felt cold against her skin. She refused to show even the slightest hint of fear. Across from her, Officer Gerald Whitmore and his junior accomplice, Daniel Reeves, stood near the door, speaking in hushed tones. Their voices, though low, carried an unmistakable air of unease. Naomi knew exactly why. The world was watching now. Back in the waiting area, her wrongful detention had ignited a storm of protests. The video of her passport being destroyed had already gone viral, spreading across social media at breakneck speed. Thousands of comments and retweets flooded platforms like X, Instagram, and TikTok, condemning the blatant racial bias and calling for immediate justice. Justice for Naomi had started trending worldwide within the hour. Meanwhile, passengers at the airport were refusing to stay silent. What had started as a few murmurs of dissent had escalated into a full-scale protest right outside the passport control area. Naomi's name was on everyone's lips, and that reality was beginning to set in for the officers holding her. The door swung open, and a new figure entered the room, a higher-ranking airport official, his expression tight with concern. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent light, and unlike Whitmore, his body language wasn't filled with arrogance, it was anxious. "Miss Carter, I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience," the official began, his voice overly polite, as if trying to smooth over what had already become a diplomatic disaster. "We are working to verify your credentials, and as soon as that is complete, you'll be free to go." Naomi remained silent for a beat, letting his words hang in the air. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his with unshakable intensity. "An inconvenience?" she repeated, her voice sharp but controlled. "That's what you call having my passport destroyed in public? Being humiliated in front of an entire crowd? Being falsely accused of fraud? This isn't an inconvenience, it's a violation." The official shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Naomi wasn't finished. "Do you even understand what you've done?" she continued, her voice rising slightly. "You've committed an international offense. I am a diplomatic representative of the Global Equity Commission, and you have not only unlawfully detained me, but also violated the Vienna Convention." The mention of international law made the official's face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. Meanwhile, Whitmore scoffed, arms crossed. "We were just following protocol," he muttered. "You people always—" Naomi's gaze snapped to him, her eyes blazing. "Finish that sentence," she said icily. For the first time, Whitmore hesitated. At that moment, the door burst open once again, and two well-dressed men in suits entered, representatives from the U.S. State Department and the Global Equity Commission. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Whitmore stiffened. Naomi's expression remained impassive, though inside she felt the slightest twinge of relief. "Miss Carter, we've been informed of what's happened," one of the diplomats began, his tone urgent. "We're here to ensure your immediate release." The State Department official turned sharply to Whitmore and the other officers. "This is an international disgrace. Do you have any idea the level of outrage you've caused?" Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. It was too late for damage control now. Outside the interrogation room, the airport protest had escalated into a major demonstration. Passengers refused to board their flights, chanting Naomi's name. Reporters had arrived en masse, cameras rolling. The global media had caught wind of the scandal, and major news networks were already covering the event as breaking news. With no other option, the airport authorities ordered Naomi's immediate release. Naomi stood calmly, watching as the officials scrambled to clear the mess they had made. But as she walked through the airport, escorted by her diplomatic team, she knew this was far from over. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about justice. And she was ready to fight for it. As Naomi Carter walked through the airport terminal, the weight of the moment settled over her. The crowd that had gathered to protest her wrongful detention erupted into applause the moment she emerged. Her head held high, her composure unwavering, despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Dozens of cameras flashed and reporters surged forward, microphones extended, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions. "Miss Carter, how do you respond to the accusations that your passport was fake? Do you believe this was racial profiling? What action will the UN take in response to this incident?" Naomi held up a hand, commanding instant silence. She knew this was her moment, a chance to turn this humiliation into power. "This is not just about me," she began, her voice clear, unwavering. "What happened today is a reflection of a much larger problem, one that thousands of people face daily. The only difference is that my case was caught on camera." Her words carried across the terminal, a moment of clarity in the chaos. If I, a diplomat, someone with legal immunity, with power and connections, can be treated like this, imagine what happens to those without a voice. Imagine the number of people who disappear into a system that does not value them, who do not have the privilege of cameras recording their mistreatment. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Passengers, employees, even journalists shifted uneasily, as if collectively realizing the weight of what she was saying. Naomi turned slightly, her eyes locking onto Officer Whitmore, who now stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold with a grim expression. His once smug arrogance had dissolved, replaced by something resembling fear, or maybe realization. He knew he had lost control of the narrative, and Naomi was just getting started. As she continued, social media was exploding with updates. The Justice for Naomi hashtag had now been picked up by major news networks. The viral video of Whitmore cutting up her passport was being replayed on a loop across television screens worldwide, drawing outrage from politicians, activists, and even fellow diplomats. The U.S. State Department had already issued a statement attempting to distance itself from the airport's actions, calling for a full and immediate investigation. Naomi wasn't naive. She knew an investigation meant nothing without pressure, without action. She intended to make sure this moment led to real change. Just then, her phone, which had been forcibly confiscated hours earlier, was returned by an airport official with shaking hands. She accepted it without a word, unlocking the screen to see hundreds of missed calls, texts, and emails flooding in. One message stood out. A direct notification from the United Nations Secretary General's office. "You are scheduled to speak at an emergency session tomorrow. The world is watching." Naomi exhaled slowly, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. This wasn't just a personal injustice anymore. This was about accountability, about systemic change. And she was ready to take the fight to the global stage. She took one last glance at Whitmore before turning toward the exit. Tomorrow, the world would hear her story. And this time, they wouldn't be able to look away. The next morning, Naomi Carter stood before the United Nations General Assembly, her presence commanding the room as cameras broadcasted her image across the world. The weight of the previous day's injustice hung in the air, magnified by the eyes of dignitaries, journalists, and millions watching from their homes. She adjusted the microphone, her expression poised yet unyielding. This moment was bigger than her. It was about the thousands of unheard voices who suffered the same treatment, without an audience, without recourse. "Yesterday," she began, her voice steady, "I was unlawfully detained, my diplomatic status disregarded, my identity questioned, not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. This is not an isolated incident. It is a pattern that allows racial bias and systemic discrimination to exist unchecked." The room fell into a heavy silence, her words sinking in. World leaders, policymakers, and activists listened intently, their expressions ranging from solemn to contemplative. The footage of her mistreatment, now one of the most watched videos of the year, played on a massive screen behind her. The blatant prejudice was undeniable, and no government could spin it away with bureaucratic excuses. "How many people," she continued, "have had their dignity stripped from them, their rights trampled, simply because they lacked the platform to fight back?" She let the question linger, her gaze sweeping across the assembly hall. "We cannot let this moment pass without action. I stand before you not just as a victim of racial profiling, but as a representative of all those who have suffered in silence. We must demand change, and we must demand it now." Applause erupted across the room, growing in strength as delegates rose to their feet, recognizing the gravity of the issue. For the first time in a long time, it seemed the world was paying attention, and Naomi intended to use this momentum to demand real reforms. As the applause settled, Naomi took a deep breath and laid out her proposal: mandatory bias training for all immigration officers globally, stronger accountability measures for officers found guilty of racial profiling, the establishment of an independent oversight committee to monitor human rights violations at international borders. She knew these demands would not be easy to achieve, but she also knew they were necessary. As she finished her speech, the Secretary General himself stepped forward. "Ms. Carter, the United Nations stands with you. We will begin discussions on these reforms immediately." The room erupted in applause once more, but Naomi knew this was only the beginning. Words meant nothing without action, and she was prepared to fight until real, enforceable policies were in place. Outside the UN headquarters, protests had erupted in major cities around the world. The hashtag Justice for Naomi had sparked an international movement, with activists demanding changes to immigration policies, law enforcement practices, and global anti-discrimination laws. She stepped outside into the bright daylight, the crowd roaring as she approached the podium for a press conference. This wasn't just a news story anymore. This was a movement, and she was ready to lead it. Naomi Carter knew that a speech, no matter how powerful, was not enough to create real change. The energy surrounding the Justice for Naomi movement was undeniable, but she also knew from history that momentum could fade quickly if not channeled into tangible action. So while the world reacted, Naomi got to work. Within days of her UN address, she and her legal team drafted formal complaints against the airport officials and law enforcement officers involved in her mistreatment. These complaints weren't just for personal justice. They were intended to set a precedent. She met with lawmakers, urging them to introduce legislation that would prevent racial profiling in immigration screenings. The bill, tentatively named the Carter Reform Act, proposed mandatory anti-bias training, increased oversight in immigration procedures, and stronger penalties for officers found guilty of racial discrimination. At the same time, she coordinated with civil rights organizations across the world, ensuring that her case became the catalyst for a broader discussion on systemic racism in border control policies. Her efforts quickly caught the attention of global leaders. Some countries openly supported her cause, pledging to reevaluate their immigration protocols. Others, however, resisted, claiming that security concerns justified stricter screening measures. But Naomi wasn't backing down. She knew the argument well. Security was always the excuse used to justify discrimination, and she made it clear that her case wasn't about compromising safety. It was about ensuring that laws were enforced fairly, without prejudice. Meanwhile, the airport where the incident occurred was facing immense pressure from the media, activists, and international organizations. The country's government had no choice but to launch a formal investigation. The officers responsible were suspended pending review, and soon after, the senior immigration officer who destroyed Naomi's passport was formally dismissed. But for Naomi, this was never just about punishing individuals. She wasn't after revenge, she was after reform. In a televised interview, she explained, "This movement isn't about a single airport or a handful of bad officers. It's about the deeper issue of how racial bias seeps into our institutions. If we don't change the system, this will keep happening to others who don't have a camera recording their injustice. That's why we fight." Her words resonated. Petitions calling for global immigration reform gathered millions of signatures. Protests continued, not just in the country where the incident happened, but in capitals around the world. It was clear this was bigger than Naomi now, and she was prepared to see it through to the very end. As Naomi Carter's fight for justice gained traction, the global response intensified. What had started as an incident at a single airport had now evolved into an international movement challenging systemic racism in immigration policies. Governments, activists, and legal experts were forced to acknowledge what marginalized travelers had been saying for years. Racial profiling was not just a rare occurrence, it was an embedded flaw in the system. Media coverage skyrocketed, with major news outlets conducting investigative reports on similar cases worldwide. Individuals from various backgrounds came forward, sharing their own horrific experiences of racial discrimination at borders, their voices adding weight to Naomi's fight. The evidence was undeniable. What happened to Naomi was part of a larger pattern of injustice that had long gone unchecked. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Critics and political opponents pushed back, arguing that Naomi's movement was an attack on law enforcement and border security. Social media saw a surge of misinformation and racist rhetoric, attempting to discredit her fight by twisting the narrative. Yet, Naomi stood her ground. In a speech at a global human rights forum, she addressed her critics head-on. "This is not about weakening security. It's about strengthening justice. No system built on bias can ever be truly secure. True safety is when every person is treated with dignity, regardless of their race, nationality, or background." Her words resonated. Public opinion overwhelmingly sided with her, and the movement only continued to grow. For Naomi, this was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about changing the future. As the months passed, Naomi Carter's relentless fight for justice transformed into a lasting movement. What had begun as a single act of prejudice at an airport had led to policy shifts, public accountability, and systemic reform discussions across multiple nations. While the officers responsible for her mistreatment faced disciplinary action, Naomi knew that true justice was not about punishing individuals. It was about changing the system that allowed such biases to persist in the first place. Her case had become a symbol of resistance, not just for diplomats or prominent figures, but for every traveler who had ever been subjected to unfair treatment based on their race or nationality. The Had Justice for Naomi movement continued to spark conversations on racial profiling in border security, leading to new international agreements, promoting transparent screening procedures and independent oversight committees to monitor immigration practices. Despite the widespread support, Naomi remained deeply aware of the work still ahead. She used her platform to advocate for travelers' rights, ensuring that immigration officials worldwide were held to higher ethical standards. She worked with legal teams to develop resources for those who had been wrongly detained, providing guidance on how to challenge unlawful discrimination. 1 year after the incident, Naomi stood before the United Nations General Assembly, addressing world leaders on the need for permanent legal frameworks that protected all travelers, not just those with diplomatic status. Her speech ended with a powerful reminder: this isn't just my story, it's the story of countless others who never had the chance to fight back. If we truly believe in justice, then we must ensure that no one is treated as less than human, no matter where they come from. As she stepped away from the podium, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Naomi Carter had not just changed policies, she had changed the world's understanding of justice. Naomi Carter's journey is more than just a story of injustice and redemption. It is a lesson in resilience, courage, and the enduring power of collective action. Her experience reminds us that injustice does not always come in loud and obvious ways. Often it begins with a small act of prejudice, an unfair assumption, or an abuse of power that many would overlook or accept as an unfortunate reality. But Naomi refused to stay silent. She refused to be just another victim of the system. Instead, she stood her ground, demanded justice, and in doing so, sparked a movement that changed the world. For many in the older generation, her story resonates on a deeper level. We have lived through decades of social change, witnessing struggles for civil rights, gender equality, and justice in all its forms. We know that history repeats itself when we allow complacency to settle in. Naomi's fight reminds us that even when the world insists on maintaining the status quo, we have a duty to push forward, to challenge the unfairness we see, and to be the voice for those who are too afraid to speak up. Her story also highlights an important truth. Real change does not happen overnight. It is a slow and often frustrating process, met with resistance from those who benefit from the system staying the way it is. But Naomi's actions prove that one person's courage can inspire thousands. With the rise of social media and global connectivity, we are now more equipped than ever to hold institutions accountable. What happened to Naomi did not remain a private humiliation. It became a global rallying cry because people chose to care. There is also a profound lesson here about the dignity of every individual. Naomi's diplomatic status should not have been the reason she was defended so fiercely. All human beings deserve to be treated with fairness and respect, regardless of their titles, backgrounds, or the color of their skin. If the incident had happened to an ordinary traveler, would the outrage have been as strong? Would the response have been as swift? True justice means standing up for those who do not have power, not just those who do. For those of us who have seen the world change, who have fought our own battles and weathered our own storms, Naomi's story is a reminder that we still have a role to play. Age does not silence our voices. If anything, it strengthens them. We have the wisdom, experience, and knowledge to guide younger generations toward a more just and equitable future. We can teach them that fighting for what is right is never easy, but it is always necessary. So, as we reflect on Naomi Carter's fight, we must ask ourselves, where do we stand when we witness injustice? Do we turn away, hoping someone else will take action? Or do we have the courage to speak up, knowing that silence only enables the wrongdoers? Because in the end, our legacy is not just in what we build or accomplish, it is in how we stand for others, how we demand justice, and how we leave the world a little fairer than we found it.